Good evening. I'm most grateful to have this opportunity to tell you about my experiences. I appreciate the introduction and some of the statistical things regarding World War II. As I came in, I saw a few gray hairs. I would suppose that the bulk of you are not in that age group. I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to look back and to get a feel for that time of prior to and during the beginning of World War II. And I'd like to take my talk in two segments. One, to tell about the build-up to World War II and the mobilization of both the civilians and the general atmosphere that existed in that time. It's very difficult for those who are not of that generation to even comprehend what it was like. It's almost like my generation not completely understanding what it was like during the Civil War. But it's important, particularly for our young people, that history come alive and we can learn from the lessons that have transpired in the past. The great Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno quoted something that is often quoted, in kind of paraphrasing: those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And unfortunately, we do that generation after generation. In my lifetime, I have seen a lot of changes, as many of you among the older segment have seen. I grew up in a small town in southeastern Idaho. Actually, for my first formative years, I attended a little country school where there were 4 teachers teaching 8 grades. And at a time when the Industrial Revolution was starting to take hold, I remember that most of the work that was done in farming was done with horses. And I had that opportunity as I was a boy and as a teenager, doing a lot of farming behind a team of horses. And I can remember when an airplane, an old biplane, would on rare occasions fly over that remote area, everyone would run out and look up and try to imagine the glories of flight. I remember that most of us little boys had a set of aviator a cap with the glasses on it, and if ever I heard a plane, I would put on my cap and rush out into the field and cry out, "Mr. Aviator, see me, see me." And it was a glorious experience. Now, in the introduction, some statistics were given to you. During World War II, there were approximately 16 million men and women in uniform. And of those 16 million, approximately 2 million were actually the combat, in combat in the various armed forces. Now, I honor every veteran who has served honorably, because whether one is in combat or not, without those in the support areas, it would have been impossible to have conducted a war and to have had a victory at the final end of it. As I was growing up, as I said, I was almost in the knowledge of wars that were going on. I was born only 8 years after the armistice was signed in World War I. And I remember when I was about in the 3rd or 4th grade, we had a local man that came dressed in his infantry doughboy uniform to speak to us on Armistice Day. Now, when I grew up, the 11th of November was when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. It was known as Armistice Day, and then since then has become Armed Forces Day. And so let me point out just a few things that led up to World War II. Now, before I do that, let me give you, and for the students, if you want to really know the basic reasons why World War I and World War II started, I would suggest that you go to Blue Stocking Press, and they have marvelous books. They're little paperbacks, they don't cost a great deal, and they also have it on economics and on justice system and many other things, and you will, I can guarantee you, you will get a better education in economics and in history than you will do in Course 101 in any university in the country. I've read those, I have some of them, and I very highly recommend them. Now, in the early 1930s, just a short time after World War I, wars began throughout Asia and in Europe. I'm not going into the reasons for those, but part of them were economic. Part of the reasons were the lack of natural resources. Wars of aggression are to obtain, to some degree, the resources of other nations, those things that you don't have. The Japanese in the early 30s invaded China, and later on, in the later 30s, they invaded Manchuria and the Soviet Union. In about 1935, as the Axis powers were beginning to grow in Europe, Germany, in Italy particularly, and there were 2 or 3 other countries, Hungary and Romania were others as a part of the Axis, and later on Japan. The little native country of Ethiopia, where warriors were still using bows and arrows and spears, were invaded with modern weapons by the fascist government of Italy under Mussolini, Benito Mussolini. In about 1936 through 39, there was a civil war in Spain. And this was used as a testing ground for the fascist forces of Germany, particularly with the Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And the Stuka bombers came into being at that time to wreak havoc upon the helpless combatants who didn't have all of the modern weapons that the others did have. Also, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland and conquered it. And shortly thereafter went into the lowlands and went into Norway. And about that same year, 1939, Russia, or the Soviet Union, invaded Finland, with whom they'd had a pact. Pacts had been arranged all along between various nations, and then they would turn against each other. And I would suggest, the Finnish War, Russian War, was a very interesting one. If you go on Wikipedia, you can get a lot of wonderful information. Now, I've done this to kind of show that there were war activities going on. And later on, Japan, of course, invaded China. Now, let's show you the horrors of war and the loss of human life. In the World War II, among the Allied forces, and we're talking about civilians, and we're talking about the attrition for the military, there were combined 61 million lives lost. That's just among the Allied nations. And among the Axis nations, there were over 12 million. Now, we're talking about the mortality rate. And so, while war may seem a little glorious to some through the movies or through other forms of entertainment, it's not fun. It's not fun for the victims. It's not fun for the participants. I remember during World War II in Hollywood, a lot of movies came out. Some of them were fairly good. Others were just simply cinematic disasters as far as verisimilitude or accuracy was concerned. There was one excellent movie that came out called The Battle of Guadalcanal, and also the Battle of Midway, while not absolutely factual in every phase, nevertheless did portray the ambience of that time. Now, in 1941, I was a student in high school, and I remember on December the 7th, 1941, I was ill. I'd had a touch of the flu. I was in bed, and I remember my family went to church, and when they came back, they were abuzz with the news that was flying about the community that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I remember the next day, I was well enough, I went to school, and we gathered around in the various rooms that had the sound system where the radio could be piped in, and we listened to President Roosevelt issue the declaration of war against Japan, a few days later against the Axis, and almost immediately mobilization began. Actually, before December the 7th, there already had started to be mobilization. A large group of men left the upper Snake River Valley, where we lived, from all of the little small towns to go to for basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington. But once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, mobilization began immediately. And then in civilian life changed dramatically overnight. Very soon there was rationing. There were the T-stamps, which you had to do to go to a service station if they had gasoline to get gas. The farmers had more because of the crucial nature of agricultural production. You had to have a ration stamp for shoes, for other foodstuffs. I can remember during high school, occasionally at a local grocery store, we'd get a small case of Wrigley's Spearmint or Juicy Fruit chewing gum. It was like striking the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you get a package some of that and pass it around. And so things changed a great deal, and then gold stars started to appear in windows. These were called Gold Star mothers. Their sons had been lost in battle. I remember the first from my little community. Young man who was lost actually had finished all of his bombing runs in Europe. He had originally joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and then had transferred over to what was then the Army Air Force. And so these gold stars would begin to appear. Some of the young men would leave school early. There was a kind of dramatic sense of being in the military until you get in there. And then that becomes quickly dissipated. I stayed, as did most of my high school schoolmates, until graduation. But once you graduated, almost immediately, within just a very few weeks, you were either drafted or you enlisted, and you were gone. I remember going down to Idaho Falls, Idaho with my father. I was 17, to sign for me to join the Navy. Now, I can't really tell you why I chose the Navy. Maybe it was because I didn't want to slog in the mud. Maybe it was because the uniform looked more romantic to the young women. I don't know. But anyway, that's what we decided. And much to the displeasure of my mother, I was the oldest of the family, and on my birthday in July of 1944, I was on a train on my way to Camp Farragut, Idaho, for my basic training. Now, at that time, there were 4 basic training areas: San Diego, Camp Farragut, which was located in northern Idaho on Lake Pend Oreille, Great Lakes, and Bainbridge, Maryland. I can remember that the servicemen in uniform could see that the raw recruits going up this train on a hot day, open windows, with coal smoke pouring in and saying, "You'll be sorry," as we go along, and how little did I know how true they were. Camp Farragut was 6 camps. We had, they were all configured in the same way. In the middle was a very large oval blacktopped area, about a mile or so in circumference, and we called it the grinder. And there was a gymnasium, there were barracks, mess hall, and outside, after you drilled all day, they loved to take you through the obstacle course. I very quickly learned that the life of the military wasn't quite as comfortable as that at home. Now, at that time, we had, and my son has various photos we'll be showing along the way. This shows the laundry. We had to learn to do our own laundry. I remember my first military assignment was with a dummy wooden rifle protecting the clotheslines. Now, what a romantic beginning that was. Did you have the mess hall there too? Yeah, so this, excuse me, go back to the barracks. Now, this is the stereotypical barracks. Down at the far end was a large pot-bellied stove. Now, the sides were just basically studs with siding on them. Down at the far end, there was what we called the head. That's the restroom, another name for restroom, where the showers and the toilet facilities were located. And in our company, all of us would be in one part of the barrack. There was a lower part, and we were in the upper part. In the summer, you would be almost heated to death, and in the winter, you'd almost be frozen to death unless you were down by the big pot-bellied stove. It was a rather pestilential time. There were a lot of communicable diseases, even including spinal meningitis. I had, as growing up, as did many of my era, almost every contagious disease that came along. The measles, the chicken pox, the whooping cough, infantigo, and I had not had scarlet fever until I got in boot camp. I was hospitalized, my group went on without me, and I was put into a convalescent group with a kind of modified training, so it prolonged my time in boot camp by several weeks. One day, we were all lined up, and we were given the first sulfa pills. Previously, sulfa would be poured in powder on a wound. And so we took this, and I found out that I was extremely allergic. I looked like a boiled lobster. And so they finally took me off that, and even today, if I go to a doctor and have to fill out a form, I let them know that I'm allergic to sulfa. I finally finished boot camp, was able to go home for a short visit. I was assigned to go to Treasure Island in San Francisco. In 1939, the World's Fair had been held at Treasure Island, which was an island about halfway between San Francisco and Oakland, connected by a big bridge. And I was placed in what was called a destroyer pool. And while we were there, we received a little training, not a great deal. On December the 24th, I left with a group, went to Oakland, and got on a train headed to Seattle. It was Christmas Eve, and I remember going up through, I don't know whether it was Northern California or Southern Oregon, but it was dinner time. And the train was on an elevated track, and I could see families right down below sitting at dinner and see a lighted Christmas tree, and it hit me with homesickness, because Christmases in our home had always been so special. The next day, about the middle of the afternoon, we arrived at a reception center. There was a great Christmas dinner, probably the only good, really good dinner I ever had while I was in the service, at least served by the service. And I still have in my book in my scrapbook, military scrapbook, that menu from that day. The next day, I joined with all of my shipmates to put a new destroyer into commission on December the 26th, 1944. It was the Douglas H. Fox DD 779. 779 is the hull designation of the ship. This was the newest class of destroyer, the Sumner class, and it was different from other destroyers because it was a little larger, it was more heavily armored, and it had two twin propellers instead of the one, which gave it greater speed and greater maneuverability. Let me tell you just a little about the dimensions of that ship. It was a little about 362 feet. If you can imagine a football field, it would have stretched out between, or a little farther than both of the goal. Now, this was not a huge ship. When you'd put alongside an aircraft carrier or a battleship or a cruiser, it looked much smaller. It had a complement of 320 men. And those of us who were the new, who had helped put it in commission, were given a little certificate as a plank owner of the quarterdeck. Now, I'm going to don my cap here. This is a special occasion. This says the Douglas H. Fox, DD 779, World War II. I'm very proud of that. I served on this ship from then on until the day I left to return to civilian life, to start the process of civilian life. Let me tell you a little bit about the armament. Most of the destroyers prior to that had maybe two mounts of a smaller, anywhere from a 3-inch to, depending on the age of the destroyer and the class, to maybe about 3.5-inch. There were three twin 5-inch 38-gun mounts, one to the aft, and then two you see towards the front. There were also two sets of torpedo tubes that would be 4 tubes per set. On the back were 2 or 3, about 4, I think, projectors that would hurl the depth charges out to the distance you wanted. And then there were 2 racks to the back in which they could be rolled off over the fantail of the ship. There were also there were 12 or 3 mounts of what we call Bofors or 40 millimeter aircraft guns. Do you want to go back to that other one with the air? Yeah, this is a quad 40 millimeter aircraft. And then there were 11 20 millimeter guns. And our captain was a very adventurous fellow, and while we were in Hawaii, he got 2 mounted on the quarterdeck, 2 big twin 50 caliber machine guns. So we were very heavily armed. Well, let me go back now to the commissioning, the formality, and in Bremerton, Washington. And while we were there, we had, of course, to load ammunition. This was a very distasteful thing because the bigger shells that you had to handle were greased. And so you would end up almost like a greased pig by the time you got done. And then all the 40 millimeter and the 20 millimeter. We also did other finishing work on the ship, and then we headed down for our shakedown cruise. And the shakedown cruise lasts for several weeks, and its purpose is to train the crew to test all of the equipment, And we hit off the Oregon coast a terrible, terrible winter storm with 50-foot waves. I was seasick. I remained seasick for almost 3 months. For those of you older ladies who have had children, I have great empathy for the morning sickness periods that you had to go through. Believe me, I know the feeling. Sometimes it was like riding an elevator. The ship would go up to the tip of the wave, and then boom, down it would go again. And when we'd reach the top, those twin propellers and rudders would stick right out of the water and shake like a dog, and then down you would go again. We had one of the crewmen had a burst appendix, and the operation was performed in that pitching sea, and he lost his life. And we pulled in to Mare Island in San Francisco, and I remember going under the Golden Gate Bridge into the calm water, and it was like I had reached heaven. But soon we were out into it again as soon as we delivered the body to Mare Island. Our shakedown cruise it was in San Diego, and then on our way to Hawaii. Again, it was rather tortuous weather, and my 40-millimeter mount was back under, you see the stacks, under that after stack, and the fumes would be blowing down into that gun tub, which just exacerbated my feeling of sickness. As I said, I got so thin that if I'd stood sideways, you'd have counted me absent. About the only thing I could really hold down were soda crackers and water. We had a man who had been in the Merchant Marine, that was on my gun crew, and he told about the trips he'd made to Hawaii, and he said, we got to go to the Dole Pineapple Factory. It is, they have cold pineapple juice coming in spigots out of the wall. And I became fixated on that. One night, as I was lying on my bunk, which is down in the fantail of the ship, and a good friend of mine who was a carpenter's mate, you say, on a steel ship, do you have carpenters? Oh, yes. Because there are things, and I'll tell you a little later how important that was. He said, come with me. And he went back to, every group had what they called a shack. It was the radio shack, the carpenter shack, the gunner's shack. And he reached in and pulled out one of those 46-ounce cans of pineapple. Where he got it, I never did find out. And got a mug. I had never tasted anything so delicious and so uplifting in my whole life. And we got to Hawaii and outfitted and made sure that we had everything. And then we started overseas in the company of a DE. Now, a DE is a smaller class. It's not of a destroyer. It's called a destroyer escort. And we were escorting the battleship Mississippi that had been damaged and had the reconstruction done on it. And we were the escort. As we were coming through the straits, which isn't too far distant, between Saipan and Tinian, one of the officers came on the loudspeaker and pointed out the cliffs that maybe some of you have seen in some of the films of war, where many of the Japanese and Japanese women would throw their children over the cliff, way down below into the rocks and the surf, and then jump in after them, because they'd been told about the brutality of the Americans, which was totally untrue, but they believed it, and so it was a tragic thing. It was shortly after that. It was a relatively calm day, it was just kind of gentle swells, and the lookouts reported a torpedo. And the torpedo passed in front of us, and by that time the battleship Mississippi and the DE had speeded up, and we remained behind, and for about an hour, almost an hour, we dropped depth charges. a little while, debris started to come up, and oil, and gurgling water. Now, in movies, you see men cheering, but that isn't quite so. Because you're struck with the sudden realization down below there are men who are dying. And you're witnessing that. And it strikes you for the first time, if you've not seen combat or anything before, this is what war is. And next time, it could be you, or it could be the man next to you. We caught up with the group, and we came into Okinawa. At that time, the Japanese were very desperate. They had organized what are called the kamikaze, which interpreted the divine wind. The Japanese Air Force and, of course, the naval force had been, by that time, almost totally obliterated. The Air Force, all of the senior combat veterans, flyers, had been killed. And so now these were young men. Many of them were 16, 17 years of age who volunteered for the kamikaze service. And the intent was, it was a suicidal thing. They would have a little ceremony on the airfield. They'd drink a little cup of sake and then take off, never to come back, because it was a suicidal mission. And we, of course, had been receiving reports en route. About 1 or 2 ships a night or a day were being either hit or sunk by kamikazes. And I remember we had heard about the destroyer Hadley. As we came into Buckner Bay, we passed the Hadley with only about that much freeboard, because of all of the pumps trying to pump out the water they'd been hit by 5 kamikazes and were still afloat. And so again, that's a very sobering effect. We were assigned to radar picket, and we got one of the hottest areas called Sector 9. And radar picket patrol consisted of 2 destroyers and 5 small gunboats. Now, the purpose of the gunboats basically was to pick up survivors. They only had one 20-millimeter anti-aircraft gun, and so that was their basic function. And what we would try to do was to pick up with radar the kamikazes coming in. Now, they like to come in just about daylight or just about dusk, and they would often come in just barely over the wave tops so that the radar had difficulty picking them up. And there was always, during the daytime, what we call the CAP, the Combat Air Patrol. Generally, these were 2 Marine Corsairs that would keep circling and flying, and as a protective thing. I remember about the first time I really saw a kamikaze. We were in Buckner Bay. You could hear the firing by the Marines and the Army up in the hills nearby. And when we had an air alert, there were smoke pots at the end on the sterns of the ship that would set up big clouds of acrid smoke to try to obscure the ships down below. And I remember this particular night, a kamikaze came in. We were kind of anchored this way, and the battleship New Mexico was over here, not too far away, and this plane was aiming for the battleship. And as it came down, diving down, and you wondered, why doesn't it go down? Because of all of the anti-aircraft that was being directed up there. And it made it through and hit the battleship New Mexico right amidships, right under the stacks. And the Japanese, the kamikazes, would carry about a 250-pound bomb to do as much damage as they could. The planes themselves were rather flimsy, just canvas and light wood with a heavy engine and a 250-pound bomb. And that was basically it. I was very concerned because one of my classmates I knew was on the battleship New Mexico, and he was a fireman. Now, firemen, these are the engine room people. And I knew that that was his station, and we received word that quite a number of the engine crew had been killed. I was very much relieved later to find out that just a week before he'd been transferred to a deck division, or otherwise he might have been a fatality. There were a little group of islands off Okinawa called Karamaretto, and we would often go in, or after we'd come in off patrol. These islands rose almost precipitously out of the ocean with deep, narrow channels, so they were protected from aircraft. And I remember coming in one evening, and we tied up alongside a destroyer tender. That is a ship that can do repairs and has certain critical supplies as needed. The next morning, when I got up, 3 other ships had tied up alongside, and the outer ship was a DE that had been hit by a kamikaze the night before. We trooped over the ships, and I saw the identification papers of a handsome 17-year-old Japanese boy. And there was a photo of a beautiful young woman and parents dressed in kimonos, traditional raiment, and I thought somebody had just lost a son, or either a boyfriend or a brother. I got souvenirs. I don't know over time what happened to him, but I had the throttle and a piece of the fabric with the Japanese markings of that kamikaze plane. At night, we would had watch with people with rifles on watch, because Japanese swimmers would try to swim out and attach limpet mines to the hulls of ships. And I always thought, what a courageous group of people these were, because that was an area that was infested with these extremely poisonous sea snakes, those big green sea snakes, and the courage it took to swim out in those areas. We never had an incident while we were in there, but it had happened. Now, finally came our turn. Well, let me go back one time. We had one morning, it was a gorgeous morning, just beautiful stuff, and it was just an ideal day. And for some reason, it was a little later in the morning when 5 kamikazes came in. We were with the destroyer Van Valkenburg. They were going this way. We were putting on speed. We were going this way, and the little gunboats were out in here. And we shot down 4 of the 5 right after they started their runs. One of them crashed into one of the little gunboats and killed about half of the small crew. The other plane came in. We're going this way, the Von Valkenburg, and it's just a short distance. I could see the head of the pilot. Very distinctly, hunched over his controls and diving in, and you know, you do get emotional. There's a lot of shouting that goes on, and every gun hammering away, and go down, go down. And pretty soon a little spark, a little flame came out of the cowling and grew, and it crashed within 20 yards of the Van Valkenburg. And so that was the first of the action we'd had actually fighting the kamikaze. We were out on Sector 9. This was almost up to the lower end of the Japanese islands. They came down from the mainland island of Japan. And it was just at dusk. The combat air patrol had been dismissed. One was very low on fuel, and so they had been dismissed to go back to base. And in came 11 kamikazes. We hurriedly picked up speed. You make a lot of smoke out of the stacks as you're doing this. There's no way you can avoid that. You either have speed or you have smoke. And out of those 11 planes, we shot down 5 of them. But one came in through the smoke, and it clipped the radar mast. I was on a quad 40 millimeter just near the bridge, and not too far away, just probably no more than 18 feet from the first 5-inch 38 gun mount. It clipped the yard arm, dove in, and it completely destroyed, demolished both of those big gun mounts. The bomb went down to about the 3rd deck and blew quite a large hole in the starboard side. And we were badly damaged. Do you have a? We do. We have a photo showing the damage. Is that it? Okay, can you see? You can see the twin gun mounts, and that's all that's left. I had, and I counted a privilege, the next morning of going and helping gather up what was left of some of my shipmates, and later helping carry their bodies ashore when we got back to Caramaretto. And the Van Valkenburg sent over a doctor. We had several other injuries as well. If you'd like a detailed account of this, you can go online and pick up, there's an organization, the Douglas H. Fox DD 779, and it has various accounts in the history and photos and things. If you're interested, you'll find things in much more detail. Well, that put us out of action. We did some temporary repairs and then headed down to Leyte in the Philippines to see if we could get additional repairs. They could do very little for us, and here's where the ship's carpenters really came into being, because timbers were brought in, and down below, almost in the forecastle area, the forward part of the ship, almost everything had been destroyed, and that was where my sleeping quarters had been assigned. I, with everyone else, I lost, all I had were the clothes on my back. No toilet articles or anything. When we were at sea, we would sleep on life jackets. Let me go back to that kamikaze attack for one thing. My recollection of it is, and I do you have it showing that the photo there of my gun? See if you can find that my combat. Okay, that would show. This is an action picture, and about right there, I was a loader on this side of that quad 40. And my gun had jammed, and I was busy. I had a tool. I was busy trying to get the clip out so we could drop the others. There were clips with 40 millimeter shells. They were about that long and about that big around, and there were 4 to a clip. And then I remember it was like a giant orange ball with specks in it. And I later determined those specks were shrapnel from the explosion. You know, you do things instinctively. And I remember just quickly diving down. Our flak jackets at that time, in the early days, didn't have them. Our life jackets had a flak plaque in the back. And I could feel that going off my helmet and off the back of my flak jacket. And I had a little nick on a thumb, and that was all. And yet, just a few feet away from me, some of my shipmates lost their lives. And I had one good friend who lost his life. He was one of the ship's cooks. That's probably one of the reasons he was my friend. You know, I belong to the Douglas H. Fox organization, and they send out a wonderful, large newsletter with photos and histories and things about every 2 months. And they always have in there a recipe for that good Navy chow. Now, I don't quite remember that. When we were out there for a long time, weevil got into our flour. We didn't mind it when the cooks made a chocolate layer cake. But when we'd eat white bread, it looked like whole wheat. But you ate it, and it was very high in protein. We had, at that time, it was just the beginning of dehydration of vegetables and of powdered eggs and powdered milk. The powdered eggs would make Dr. Seuss proud because they would turn green when they were cooked. And but you ate them because that's what you had. And by the same thing of the vegetables, and the powdered milk was awful. My friend, the one who lost his life, had developed a little recipe where he would take this awful tasting powdered milk and the awful tasting powdered eggs, and he'd put sugar and vanilla in and make a little eggnog with it. And that made it a little bit more palatable. Our refrigeration was knocked out by that bomb explosion. And for all the way down to Leyte, we ate Spam sandwiches. Now, the Spam used to come in those large 5-pound tins. Do you know, it's odd, but I still like Spam today. That's an anomaly. At Leyte, the ship's carpenters, they brought large timbers aboard, and down below they crisscrossed and to shore up the weak sides, and of course over the hole in the starboard side, big steel plating had been welded in, and we were sent to Guam. And one of the worst typhoons of that time hit us. 2 ships went down, and we took a terrible pounding. We could hear down below zing, as pieces of timber would sliver off and go flying out. Of course, no one was down there, but it was a frightful thing. And when we arrived at Guam, we received more supplies. They couldn't do more for us, and we were sent to Pearl Harbor. It was at Pearl Harbor when we got in that the supply people, the Quartermaster Corps, came aboard, and we filled out forms indicating all of the clothing and everything else that we had lost. And later that afternoon, they brought aboard new clothing and the toiletries and so forth, which we so badly needed. They could do not a lot for us there. You know, at that time during the war, at Pearl Harbor, how many of you have been to Pearl Harbor and seen the Arizona? Well, nothing was there except sunken ships, portions of them sticking out of the water, until after the war when the harbor was cleared and then that memorial was made. We were then sent to Hunters Point, San Francisco. It was a shipyard. This is very near present-day Candlestick Park. And we went into dry dock, and we were placed on a barge, a living barge. Oh, it was a wonderful time to go in and have a good meal at a nice Chinese restaurant or down at Fisherman's Wharf. It was, I was on an August day, August 5th, I had liberty, and I was headed out of the shipyard, and suddenly a tremendous bedlam. Whistles were going off, horns were honking, there was shouting. The surrender of Japan had been announced. I went down to Market Street in San Francisco. If you've ever seen bedlam, that was something that was unforgettable. Out of trying to save life and limb, I only stayed down an hour and came back. But people were rioting almost and celebrating. Liquor store windows had been broken open, and pretty soon a lot of sailors were more than 4 sails to the wind, and other service people. I can remember one sailor running wildly up the street, hatless, hair flying, carrying a department store mannequin. And but it was a joyous time. The war was over. The war in Europe had been over, and in October, repairs had been finished, and we were sent to join our task force. Included the battleship Missouri, where the treaty or the armistice had been signed, the surrender had been signed, and we transited the Panama Canal. I had an article written about me several years ago by Best Years magazine, and they put in a little story I'd told them. I didn't know they were going to do it, called Swimming with the Crocodiles. As we were coming through the Panama Canal, which is of course freshwater, we pulled over off the main shipping lanes, and they said, "This will be your only opportunity to have freshwater swimming." Now, every sailor had a swimming suit as part of his issue. Boy, we ran down. What a wonderful opportunity. Soon we were diving off the superstructure, off the deck, and having a wonderful time. And they started to do recall, and I came back in, and I noticed the motor whale boat with riflemen out there, and I said, jokingly, "Do you think that we're going to try to escape?" He said, "Oh no, they're looking for crocodiles." I thought, if I'd known that, I'd been a little less enthusiastic about going into the water. Ships dispersed all the way from Florida up to Boston for Navy Day in October of 19. Don't want to get too old. Of 1945. We were fortunate to be sent to New York. We went to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We painted the ship. We had the various flags showing the planes and submarine and other things, and we you see a little example there. And then we were berthed off Greenwich Village, near on the Hudson River, and we conducted tours. And we'd have school children. Everyone was so excited to have this large fleet in. And I remember being designated as a guide for a group of ladies club ladies from Brooklyn. And they became beautifully dressed with the fox fur collars. Got about halfway through, and one of them said, "Well, young man, where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Idaho." She turned to her companions and said, "See, I told you so." And she said, and to me, I knew you were from somewhere else. She says, "Because you're very polite. Besides that, you talk funny." And I remember a group of school children coming. The ship carpenters had built a ramp going up, because to get up to the upper deck, you went up a straight ladder. And they built one where the guests could get on up to the upper deck and see some of the guns and the torpedo tubes and so forth. And I better hurry, hadn't I? I can wind up in another hour or so. No, wait a minute. I'll do it more quickly. Just a few more minutes. But a couple of the men reported laughing afterward. This group of children, back in those days, many of the teachers were very young women, maybe 19 years of age, because of many of the older women had gone into the war production area, and the young teacher was saying, "Hoibert, now let the goils go first, Hoibert. Hoibert, leave the goils alone. Hoibert, do you hear me? I'm going to lay it on you, Hoibert." And the fellow said, "Lady, don't these kids just drive you nuts?" And she said, "Nah, you learn to love them after you work with them a while." And I suppose that is every teacher. But anyway, on Navy Day, it was a wonderful time there. I got to see big name bands. I won't name all of them. I have in my scrapbook the original program from Oklahoma that I saw, the original Carousel, which I saw while I was there, and other Broadway productions. Oh, what a wonderful time that was. On Navy Day, we were dispersed up and down the Hudson River up to above the George Washington Bridge near the Bronx. And we stood at attention while the Commander-in-Chief, Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States, on another destroyer, cruised up one side and then down the other, and we saluted the Commander-in-Chief. The battleship Missouri there, the famous aircraft carrier, the Big E, was there. There were destroyers, there were cruisers, there were submarines, all who had seen action and combat. Shortly after that, we went down to Norfolk and to take the newest aircraft carrier, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, on a shakedown cruise out of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And our escort duty was to pick up pilots that crashed into the sea. And we were able to rescue almost all except one or two. And what a tragic thing when you could see they could come up quickly and see the bubbles down below and knew that there was no way you could save those people. We later went down as emissaries for the inauguration of the Brazilian president in January. And that's when I had my inauguration going across the equator. Now, I can't tell you all of the sordid details, but believe me, it was an experience to go from a pollywog to a shellback. I will tell you just two things, and this lasted 2 days. And all of the old-timers had shillelaghs they'd made, taking canvas and then stuffing them with little shillelaghs where they could tap you every time they went by. One of the worst parts was having to kneel down before King Neptune and the Royal Princess. The Royal Princess was a scrawny little fellow with a very hairy chest, and they would smear grease all over his navel, and you had to kiss the Royal Princess on the navel. The other was, the very final thing was to go through a large canvas chute about that size and about 20 feet long, filled with ship garbage from the kitchen. And they would tap you with the shillelaghs as you went along, and if they didn't like you, they just pinch it off. And then they could really whack you. Well, it was a wonderful time going down to Rio. It was a big change. We did have a number of interesting experiences while we were there. And I could go on for a long time, but I've used my time. I am grateful to have served. I don't want to do it again, but I'm grateful to serve, and I honor all now and then who have served honorably. One of my favorite things is to see the large crowd gathered at the local airports to see the men coming in from Iraq or Afghanistan who have been there, and to be reunited, see the children running to throw themselves into their father's arm, and the father to embrace his wife. And I think it's wonderful. It was quite a bit different back after World War II. There, of course, there were big ticker tape parades in New York and Chicago and elsewhere. But most of us, in fact, nearly all of us, came home quietly. I remember getting off the bus, walking up the street to my home, and there was very little fuss made, which, people were coming home over an extended period of time. But there was such relief to have the war over and to have their loved ones back. I kind of concluding, I remember my parents, my mother's telling how they would listen to the radio about the reports. They knew about where I was, not specifically, and the concern they had not knowing what was happening to me. As were millions of other mothers and fathers with their sons. And being able to, and not being really knowing and unsure, and what a relief to have that son or that daughter come home and be safe and sound. Again, I thank you for listening to me this for a long time. I hope that you young people will remember that the lives that were lost has provided us with our standard of living and the freedoms. I had friends not only on the ship, but I knew of others and from that I had known who lost their lives. And I think of them often. There were, of those 16 million, there are around 2 million of us left, and we're disappearing at the rate of around 1,200 a day. Thank you for your attention and being present.
The question was, what was the name of your hometown?
I'm from St. Anthony, Idaho. That's about 12 miles north of Rexburg in the upper Snake River Valley.
And today he lives in Pleasant Grove, is that right? Today?
I do.
Yeah. Question is, did you know was it the Klinger that lived in Alpine, Wyoming?
Well, there was a Klinger family in St. Anthony. I don't know, they may be related to those, but I don't know the ones in Alpine. Or was it Afton?
The question is, what day is Navy Day?
Well, it was, I think, on October, in 1945, it was October the 5th. I don't know whether they even celebrate it now. It's Veterans Day probably has probably superseded everything.
The question is, what did you do for a living when you got out of the Navy?
I spent 19 years as a high school and junior college teacher. Now, someone is supposed to ask me what I taught.
What did you teach?
Judging by the results, not very much. No, I was a foreign language teacher. And then I left teaching in 1972 and was accepted as a owner-operator licensee of the McDonald's Corporation, and built and operated 3 McDonald's restaurants in Las Cruces, centered around Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Mr. Dayton, thank you once again for your service and for being with us. Terrific job.